The shelter sat on the outskirts of town where the pavement cracked into gravel and the mountains rose like silent witnesses. From the road it looked ordinary, beige walls, a faded sign, flags snapping in the wind. But inside, stories lingered in every corner. Stories of loss, of hope, of second chances that sometimes never came. In the very last kennel, far from the barking and the wagging and the pleading eyes, lived a dog who had quietly become a legend. They called him Shadow. Not because of his fur, though it was dark, almost black, but because of how he existed, always pressed into corners, always half hidden, always looking down. For 3 years, Shadow had not looked at a single human being. Not once. Volunteers remembered the first night he arrived. It had been late, close to midnight, when a state trooper radioed in about a dog wandering near the interstate. Traffic was light but fast. Too fast. When they found him, he wasn't running anymore. He was standing perfectly still on the shoulder, head low, body rigid, as if moving would cost him something he couldn't afford to lose. No tags, no collar, no microchip. Just scars. A deep groove around his neck told its own story, one of chains, of tension, of years pulling against metal that never gave. His ribs showed through his coat. One ear was torn at the edge. But the most unsettling thing wasn't his body. It was his eyes. They never rose. Even as they lifted him into the truck, even as the shelter lights flicked on too bright and too sudden, Shadow kept his gaze locked on the ground, as if the floor was safer than the world above it. The staff assumed it was temporary. Most traumatized dogs came around eventually. Food helped, time helped, patience helped. Shadow refused all three. He ate, but only when no one was watching. He moved, but only when necessary. And when people spoke to him, gently or firmly or desperately, he reacted the same way. By shrinking inward, folding himself smaller, his eyes glued to the concrete like it held answers humans never did. Days became weeks, weeks turned into months. Still, Shadow never looked up. The shelter tried everything. They sat outside his kennel for hours, backs against the wall, speaking softly about nothing at all. They tossed treats and rolled tennis balls and brought in the calmest dogs they had, hoping companionship might unlock something. A trainer came in, then another. They dimmed the lights, played music, gave him space, gave him structure. Nothing worked. Shadow didn't growl, didn't bite, didn't bark. He simply withdrew. And somehow that was worse. Visitors passed his kennel without slowing down. Children tugged their parents toward puppies and dogs with hopeful eyes and spinning tails. Shadow was invisible unless you were looking for him, and even then, he didn't return the favor. Some volunteers stopped trying after the first year. It wasn't cruelty. It was survival. The shelter was full. New dogs arrived every week, broken in louder, more obvious ways. Dogs that cried, dogs that shook, dogs that needed hands immediately. Shadow didn't ask. He existed. By year 2, his name was whispered with a kind of resignation. "He's just gone," one volunteer said quietly while cleaning his kennel. "Whatever he was before, it's buried." The shelter director, a woman named Marlene who had been there long enough to see miracles and tragedies in equal measure, refused to give up entirely. She moved Shadow to a quieter wing, put up a sign asking people not to approach unless supervised. She told herself that as long as he was breathing, there was still time. But even she had stopped expecting change. By year 3, Shadow was no longer listed on the adoption board, not because he was dangerous, but because no one knew how to explain him. How do you advertise a dog who won't meet your eyes? How do you promise love when the dog himself seems convinced it doesn't exist? Winter came early that year. Snow dusted the mountains and crept into the town like a warning. The shelter grew quieter, fewer visitors, fewer chances. Shadow turned 4 in that kennel. No one knew the exact date, so they guessed. A small note was taped to his chart, approximate age, 4 no party, no treats with candles, just another day where the sun rose and set without him noticing. On a Tuesday afternoon, the wind picked up, rattling the chain-link fences outside. Inside, volunteers moved through their routines, cleaning, feeding, recording notes that rarely changed when it came to Shadow. Then Marlene checked her email. The subject line was short: elementary school volunteer visit Thursday. She hesitated. The shelter had hosted school groups before, but usually stuck to the front kennels. Puppies, friendly dogs, easy stories. Shadow's wing was always off limits. Too quiet, too heavy. She almost deleted the email. But then she read the message twice. One teacher had written a note at the bottom. One student is very insistent on coming. He doesn't speak much, but he says he wants to sit with the dogs. Marlene leaned back in her chair. Something about that line lingered longer than it should have. Thursday arrived cold and gray. The sky hung low, threatening snow. Volunteers swept floors and double-checked gates. Dogs sensed the change before the bus arrived, barking, packing, excitement buzzing through the building. Shadow did not move. He lay curled in his usual corner, nose tucked beneath his tail, breathing slow and shallow. If the world outside his kennel was changing, he gave no sign of noticing. The yellow bus pulled in with a hiss of brakes. Children spilled out in coats and backpacks, voices loud and sharp against the quiet shelter air. Laughter echoed. Questions flew. Can we pet them? Which one is the cutest? Are they sad? Marlene gave her practice smile and her usual speech about gentleness and listening and respect. Shadow stayed where he was. As the group moved inside, the sound hit him like a wave. Too much, too fast. His muscles tensed, his ears flattened. He pressed deeper into the corner, eyes locked firmly on the floor. Footsteps approached his wing. Marlene paused, instinctively raising a hand to stop the group, but the teacher gently redirected most of the children to the front. Most. Except one. A small boy lingered behind. He didn't run, didn't shout, didn't ask questions. He stood very still at the edge of the hallway, backpack straps clutched in his fists, eyes drifting, not upward but sideways. Toward the last kennel. Toward the dog who hadn't looked up in 3 years. Marlene felt her chest tighten. Shadow sensed it. Not the boy, not yet. But something had shifted. The air felt different. He didn't lift his head, didn't turn his eyes. But for the first time in a very long time, Shadow stopped shrinking. And in that fragile pause between noise and silence, between past and possibility, no one knew that everything was about to change. Shadow's world was small. It was the kennel, the concrete floor, the chain-link walls, and the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead. For 3 years that had been enough, safe enough, predictable enough. His memories of what came before the chain, the sharp voices, the sudden jerks that tore at his neck, flickered sometimes, and he didn't want to remember. So he didn't. He looked down, he walked slowly. He existed like a shadow, moving through life without claiming it. The staff had long stopped asking why he didn't respond. Questions were pointless with Shadow. They tried names, tones, and tones again, but it was always the same. Nothing. A wag of a tail, a bark, a glance, none of it. Shadow had given himself a life of silence. Some said it was depression. Others whispered that he had just given up. But Marlene knew better. She had seen dogs like this before, not broken exactly, not hopeless. Just waiting, waiting for something they didn't know how to hope for anymore. Every morning, volunteers entered the kennel corridor with careful footsteps. Shadow's head would lift just a fraction, not enough to see them, but enough to know they were there. They cleaned, they fed, they replaced water bowls. Shadow never growled, never lunged, never barked. He simply watched, a quiet observer of the world that had once hurt him. They tried routines because structure was safety. Morning feeding, midday cleaning, evening rounds. Shadow never deviated from his corner. If a dog barked, he flinched. If a hand reached toward him, he folded tighter as if trying to disappear entirely. And yet he survived. Day after day, week after week. The human world continued, indifferent, but Shadow endured. Years passed in this rhythm, and he became a ghost among the living. Children on field trips would press their faces to the kennel bars, laugh, point, whisper, and then move on. Volunteers would sigh, shaking their heads. He was impossible. He was unadoptable. Then came the letters and emails from schools. Initially, Marlene ignored them. Shadow was too fragile for children, too unpredictable, but there was one that made her pause. The note was short, in neat, careful handwriting. "There's a boy 7 years old. He wants to sit. He says he has to sit with a dog. Please let him, thank you." Marlene hesitated. Shadow did sit with anyone. He didn't let anyone near him, but there was a sincerity in that note she couldn't ignore. Thursday arrived gray and cold. Snow had started in the mountains, dusting the horizon with white. Inside the shelter, the hum of the heating system and the soft scrape of mops were the only sounds. Dogs padded in their kennels, restless but contained. Shadow lay in his usual corner, head down, ears back, body tense. The school bus arrived late, its yellow sides streaked with mud from the icy roads. Children spilled out, coats and scarves wrapped around them, backpacks slipping from small shoulders. Laughter bounced off the walls, echoing down the corridors. The volunteers led the kids to the front kennels where smaller, friendlier dogs awaited. Puppies wiggled and yipped. There was noise, chaos, and excitement. Shadow did not stir. All except one. Eli. He was quiet, too quiet. Small for his age, hair a dark mess over his forehead, eyes scanning, alert but cautious. He didn't rush. He didn't run. He didn't tug at the volunteer's hand, asking to go faster or see the fun dogs. He lingered at the end of the row, near the kennels most people avoided, near the one kennel where Shadow waited. Marlene watched, heart tightening. She knew this was dangerous. Not dangerous in the usual way, a child getting bitten, but dangerous in a fragile, unpredictable way. Shadow hadn't let anyone approach him in 3 years, not even her. And yet this boy was moving closer, one small, deliberate step at a time. The other children laughed and shouted, but Eli walked through the chaos like a shadow himself. Silent, patient. His eyes never left the kennel. Shadow's ears twitched. Every instinct told him to curl tighter, to retreat, to hide. He had done it for years. It was safe. It was predictable. But something was different this time. The boy stopped a few feet away. He sat cross-legged on the cold concrete floor, back straight, hands resting on his knees. He didn't reach, didn't call, didn't make a sound. He just waited. Shadow watched. Not from above, not looking up, but the corner of his vision. His body was taut, every muscle coiled, but he didn't move away. The volunteers held their breath. Minutes passed. The shelter seemed to shrink around them. Every footstep, every cough, every whisper of a jacket zipping up sounded louder than usual. Shadow's tail twitched ever so slightly. His ears rotated. His nose lifted just a fraction. He didn't look at the boy, not yet. But he acknowledged his presence. For 3 years, that was the most anyone had ever achieved. Marlene stepped closer, heart hammering. Don't force him," she whispered to the volunteers. "Just let him be." Eli's face was unreadable. His mouth pressed into a line, but his eyes softened. They weren't wide with excitement. They weren't full of fear. They just waited. Shadow had learned over the years that the world was dangerous. Hands could hurt. Voices could hurt. Looking up could hurt. But for some reason, something he couldn't explain, he felt a twinge of curiosity. A flicker. His nose lifted slightly. He sniffed the air, small, careful sniffs. He recognized the scent, boy, not threatening, not loud, just present. Not many humans had been just present in his life. Not for long. The minutes stretched like hours. Volunteers tried not to breathe too loudly. The chaos of the other children faded into background noise. Only Shadow and Eli remained, two silent beings observing each other through space, time, and fear. And then something remarkable happened. Shadow's paw twitched, just a tiny motion. His shoulder shifted forward, nothing dramatic. No one noticed at first except Marlene, who saw it out of the corner of her eye. He hadn't moved toward the boy, he hadn't lifted his head, but he had shifted his weight in a way that said, "I see you. I acknowledge you." For 3 years, no one had ever achieved that. And yet the story wasn't over, not even close. Something about the boy, about his quiet patience, his presence without force, stirred something deep inside Shadow. Not trust, not yet, not hope, just a flicker. A memory, long buried, of what it felt like to be safe, to be noticed without danger, to be acknowledged without pain. Shadow's ears twitched, his tail twitched, his nose flared, and for the first time in 3 years he didn't look away. The volunteers exchanged glances. Their faces were pale, hearts pounding. No one dared speak. All that remained was silence. And the boy, waiting, watching, knowing, and the dog, trembling at the possibility of change. A change that no one could predict. A change that could begin with just one word. Eli was small for his age, no taller than the edge of the kennel bars. His coat was too thin for the Colorado winter, and his backpack slipped from his shoulders each time he adjusted it. But there was something about him, something quiet, still, and determined, that immediately set him apart from the other children. While the others laughed and shoved each other forward to reach the friendliest dogs, Eli walked slowly, deliberately, like a shadow moving through sunlight, careful not to disturb what was fragile. He paused at the end of the corridor near Shadow's kennel. Volunteers held their breath. Even Marlene stepped back, heart pounding. She had seen many children in her years at the shelter. Loud, bright, excitable children were common, but a child who could be silent in the middle of chaos, rare, unnervingly rare. Eli's eyes lingered on the dog curled in the corner. Shadow's fur was darker than midnight, mottled with scars that ran like jagged lightning across his body. His head stayed low, ears back, and every muscle in his frame was taut, ready to retreat at the slightest sound. Yet Eli didn't flinch. He didn't reach out. He didn't speak. He just observed. The boy lowered himself to the floor, legs crossed, hands resting gently on his knees. His face was calm, almost solemn, a stark contrast to the chaos around him. He wasn't staring aggressively, wasn't smiling or trying to coerce the dog. He simply existed. Shadow noticed this. Something deep inside, buried beneath years of fear, stirred. Shadow's nose twitched. He inhaled cautiously, small, shallow breaths that barely lifted his chest. His eyes, still downcast, tracked the boy's movements in peripheral vision. He didn't move closer, not yet, but he didn't pull back either. For the first time in years, Shadow acknowledged a human's presence without fear. Minutes passed. The other children had moved on, pressed forward to greet barking puppies and friendly beagles. Laughter and shouts faded, leaving an almost sacred silence around Shadow's kennel. Only Eli remained. He didn't fidget. He didn't whisper to himself. He simply sat there, observing, patient, as if he knew that forcing anything would be disastrous. Shadow's muscles began to relax slightly. A tail twitch, a shoulder shift, a flick of an ear. Nothing dramatic, nothing anyone else could easily notice, but Marlene and the volunteers could see it. They exchanged glances, eyes wide. This was progress. Fragile, tentative, yet real progress. Eli finally whispered something, just a breath, barely audible. "Hi." The word was so soft, so tentative it could have been missed entirely. Shadow froze, his body tensed, nostrils flaring. He had not heard a human voice directed at him for years, and yet the sound wasn't sharp or threatening. There was no command, no insistence, no loud laughter, just a soft greeting. Shadow's head lifted slightly, not fully, not to meet the boy's gaze, but enough to signal curiosity. The corner of his eye followed Eli. The dog's body was rigid, but his stance had changed. For the first time, the air between them felt different. Eli's face softened. He didn't reach through the bars. He didn't make sudden movements. He just stayed there, letting the silence stretch, letting Shadow come to his own decision. His eyes, wide and earnest, held something Shadow hadn't seen in years: patience without expectation, understanding without judgment. The other volunteers hovered nearby, uncertain if they should intervene. One small step, one sudden movement could shatter the fragile bridge forming between boy and dog. Marlene shook her head subtly. "Do nothing. Let him lead." Shadow's nose twitched again, this time more pronounced. He inched forward just a little so the scent of Eli drifted closer. His paws scraped softly against the concrete floor. His tail twitched once, then again. The tension in his shoulders remained, but his breathing slowed, his head lifted incrementally. Eli spoke again, still whispering just a few words. "It's okay." Shadow flinched as if the words struck him physically. His ears flattened momentarily, then lifted. His muscles trembled, his ribs visible beneath his dark coat. He didn't move away. He didn't growl. He didn't bark. He stayed in place, frozen yet curious, fragile yet alive. The volunteers gasped. A week of careful observation and patience could not have achieved more. Shadow's gaze, still partially downcast, had lifted just enough to acknowledge the boy's presence. And in that acknowledgement, something miraculous began. Shadow's eyes, though still wary, started to follow Eli's hand as it rested on his knee. Not reaching, not touching, just there. Shadow's head shifted slightly, a slow, deliberate movement, closer than he had allowed anyone in 3 years. Eli's hand remained still. He didn't push, he didn't coax. He simply existed, patient, calm, and utterly non-threatening. Time seemed to stretch. The world outside the kennel, the shouts, the laughter, the clamor of human life faded. The shelter became a stage of suspended tension. 2 beings, boy and dog, locked in a silent, fragile dance of trust. Shadow's breathing slowed further. His muscles began to loosen. His tail flicked once, then again. His nose, twitching constantly, inched closer to Eli's hand, and then a paw lifted. Not fully, not reaching out yet. Just a gentle, tentative lift hovering above the floor. It was an acknowledgement, a question. Could he trust this boy? Would it hurt him if he tried? Eli's eyes softened further. His lips curved into the faintest of smiles. He whispered again, almost to himself this time. "I know you're scared." The sound of understanding, the weight of patience, struck Shadow. He lowered his head slightly, trembling, but the paw remained lifted. A single, fragile motion that spoke of hope, of curiosity, of the first tentative steps toward connection in 3 long years. The shelter volunteers stood frozen. None dared breathe too loudly. No one moved. Shadow's small movements were a world-shaking event in their quiet corner of the building. Then, almost imperceptibly, Shadow inched closer to the bars. His body was tense, ready to flee, but his nose was now near Eli's fingers. He sniffed the air. A tentative inhale, as if trying to measure whether safety was real. Eli didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. He didn't reach out. He simply waited, patient, calm, present. Shadow's ears twitched. His eyes followed every movement. And then, as if some invisible barrier had been lifted, his gaze met Eli's fully, completely. For the first time in 3 years, Shadow looked into a human eyes. Not past him, not through him, at him. A gasp escaped Marlene's lips. Volunteers whispered, tears forming. The air in the shelter was thick, heavy, alive. Something profound had happened. Something fragile yet powerful. Shadow's trembling body began to relax. His tail wagged just slightly, tentative, uncertain, but real. His paw lowered and he inched forward. Slowly, cautiously, step by careful step, he moved closer to the boy who had dared to be still in the chaos. Eli whispered again, "You're safe." Shadow froze. Then slowly, impossibly, he pressed his nose against the bars, aligning it with Eli's small hand. A touch, a connection, a bridge. The room was silent except for shallow breaths and the faint hum of the heating system. In that moment, Shadow's world expanded. One boy, one whispered word, one patient presence, enough to break through 3 years of fear. And the story, just beginning, was about to change forever. The shelter corridor was quiet now, almost painfully so. The echoes of other children's laughter, the shuffling of coats and backpacks, had faded down the hall. All that remained was the soft, uneven rhythm of Shadow's breathing, and the small, deliberate presence of Eli sitting cross-legged on the cold concrete floor. The world outside, the noisy, chaotic, bustling life of the shelter, seemed to have collapsed into a single, fragile bubble, enclosing dog and boy in a space suspended between fear and hope. Shadow's head remained low, barely lifted from the floor, but something had shifted. His nose twitched constantly, nostrils flaring as he drew in the faint, unfamiliar scent of this small human who dared to exist without demand or expectation. He had smelled hundreds of people over the past 3 years, all of them intrusive, threatening, loud, or overbearing. Eli smelled different, not threatening, not overwhelming, not chaotic, just present. Eli did not move. His hands rested lightly on his knees. He did not speak. He did not reach. He simply breathed slow and steady and let Shadow take the lead. There was no command, no coaxing, no insistence. Just a presence that said, "I am here. You are safe. You may come if you choose." For a dog who had spent 3 years avoiding every human gaze, 3 years refusing the world, this was radical. Shadow's muscles remained tense, but his tail twitched for the second time in minutes. The movement was small, almost imperceptible, but for the volunteers and Marlene watching from a cautious distance, it was a spark, a tiny signal that the impossible was beginning. Minutes passed. Shadow inched forward, one careful, deliberate step. The kennel bars rattled slightly beneath his paw as he shifted his weight. He lowered his nose almost to the floor and sniffed cautiously, drawing in Eli's scent, memorizing it. The child's presence was steady, calm, grounding. No sudden movements, no loud noises, no threatening gestures, just stillness. For the first time, Shadow experienced a sensation he had forgotten existed, curiosity without fear. His ears flicked forward slightly, alert but not defensive. His eyes, still partially averted, tracked Eli's slight movements. He noticed the rise and fall of the child's chest, the way his small shoulders barely moved with each inhale and exhale. These were new details, minute and intimate, and they drew Shadow closer without any conscious thought. Eli shifted slightly, leaning forward just enough that the floor beneath his hands pressed against the cold concrete. He didn't speak, didn't reach out, didn't make a sudden sound. He simply waited, an anchor of quiet presence. For Shadow, it was almost unbearable. He had lived in fear for so long that the very idea of safety, the idea that someone could simply exist without threatening him, was terrifying in its novelty. Shadow's paw twitched, then his other paw shifted, a slow, deliberate step forward. His nose came closer to Eli's fingers. The scent of the boy filled his senses. Warm, calm, persistent, trustworthy. Almost instinctively, Shadow pressed his nose closer, brushing the tips of Eli's fingers through the bars. A contact so small, so tentative that it could have been missed entirely, but for both, it was monumental. Time seemed to dilate. A minute felt like an hour felt like a day. Shadow froze, ears pricked, tail tucked close but quivering. He had never been this close to a human without fear. The instinct to flee pulsed through his muscles, old reflexes screaming at him to turn, to hide, to curl up into nothingness. But something in Eli's stillness countered it. Something in the way the boy simply existed without expectation, without movement, without demand, allowed Shadow to consider a different choice. Not running. The volunteers watched silently, tears threatening in their eyes. No one dared move. No one dared speak. Shadow's tiny shifts were monumental. Every twitch of his nose, every slight lift of his head, every tentative paw movement was a victory in a battle none of them had dared hope to witness. Eli's face softened. He didn't smile widely. He didn't speak. He simply leaned forward slightly, a subtle motion, a quiet invitation. And Shadow responded, tiny step by tiny step, inch by inch, paw by paw, until he was close enough that the tips of his muzzle brushed the back of Eli's hand. The contact was light, careful, deliberate. A single point of connection after 3 years of isolation. Shadow's eyes flicked up, not fully, not confidently, but just enough to acknowledge the boy's presence directly. The corners of Eli's lips curved slightly. He whispered, a sound so soft it could almost be mistaken for a breath. "You're okay." Shadow flinched, trembling. His body froze, ears down, muscles taut. The word struck him not as a threat but as a recognition. Someone saw him, not as a problem, not as a failure, not as a creature to be fixed, but as a being worth noticing. For the first time in years, Shadow considered a possibility he hadn't allowed himself to imagine: safety, acceptance, care. He took another tiny step forward, nose brushing fingers, paw hovering uncertainly, body trembling but moving. Eli didn't flinch. He didn't shift away. He simply stayed present, calm, patient. A human who refused to hurry him, to demand, to scare, to intrude. Shadow's eyes flicked up again, this time slightly wider, the faintest glimmer of recognition. Not joy, not trust, not hope, not yet, but a spark, a flicker of possibility. The volunteers dared to breathe. Marlene's hand hovered over the clipboard she had forgotten to drop, her pulse racing. This moment, this fragile, trembling, perfect moment, was unprecedented. Shadow had allowed a human to exist in his space without fleeing. He had acknowledged a presence without fear. He had not run. Not yet fully, not yet openly, but enough. Then, almost imperceptibly, Shadow leaned forward. Just a fraction, just a subtle movement of his shoulders, his body shifting toward the boy. His head lifted slightly, ears forward, eyes tracking. Not fully open, not fully engaged, but moving. And in that movement, the world changed. The stillness between dog and boy stretched. Hours could have passed in that bubble of time. Shadow's breathing slowed. His body relaxed just a fraction. Tail flicked slightly. Paw lowered. Nose rested lightly against Eli's hand. And then something unexpected happened. Shadow tilted his head just slightly, as if to listen. Eli's breath hitched softly. He whispered again, voice barely above the concrete floor. "I'm not going anywhere." The words, simple and unthreatening, were the final thread. Shadow's muscles loosened. He didn't lunge, he didn't bark, he didn't run, he stayed, present, still, connected. For 3 years, no one had been able to do this. No human, no hand, no voice. Shadow had given himself entirely to avoidance, to fear, to isolation. And now, in this single corridor with this single child, the impossible was happening. Shadow was beginning to trust. It wasn't complete, not by far. His tail twitched irregularly. His body remained tense. But for the first time in years, Shadow didn't look away. He didn't shrink. He didn't disappear. He existed. And the stillness, the first stillness, was the beginning of something larger, something miraculous, something that neither Shadow nor Eli fully understood yet, but both felt with the clarity of instinct, connection. Marlene exhaled quietly, barely moving. The other volunteers were frozen, tears glinting in their eyes. Shadow's tentative steps, his trembling pause, his lifted gaze, it was as if the room itself was holding its breath. Eli whispered one more time, "You're not alone." Shadow flinched at first, then inhaled deeply. He pressed his nose harder against the boy's fingers. Paw lifted again, hovering, then lowered. Tail flicked. Body relaxed just slightly, more than ever before. The bubble of stillness remained. Hours could have passed. Moments were infinite. And for the first time in 3 years, Shadow let himself feel something he had almost forgotten existed, the possibility of being seen. Not as a problem, not as a mistake, not as a shadow to hide, but as himself. And in that suspended, silent moment, the shelter, the world, even the past, all of it seemed to pause. Everything had changed. The corridor was silent now. The chatter, the laughter, the shuffling of other children, all of it had disappeared into the background, replaced by the electric tension of two beings locked in fragile proximity. Shadow's dark eyes followed every imperceptible movement of Eli. The little boy sat cross-legged, hands resting gently on his knees, and radiated an aura that was both patient and powerful in its stillness. Shadow's body was tense, muscles taut as bowstrings. Every instinct screamed at him to flee, to retreat, to shrink back into the corner of his kennel where nothing could reach him. But something was happening. Something in the boy's presence, in the quiet steadiness of his breathing, in the gentle warmth that radiated from his small body, was breaking down walls that Shadow had built brick by brick over 3 long years. Minutes passed in suspended silence. Shadow inched forward slightly, then stopped. Paw lifted, hovering over the concrete floor, then lowered again. Nose sniffed, head tilted just enough to catch the faint scent of the boy's skin and clothes. Tail flicked once, twice. The first tiny movements of life, curiosity, trust, and connection in 3 years. Eli watched, calm and unafraid. His fingers hovered over the bars but did not touch. He didn't make sudden movements. He didn't reach out. He simply existed, letting the dog make the first choice. For Shadow, that choice was terrifying and intoxicating. Finally, Eli leaned forward just a little, his lips barely moving. He whispered, a fragile sound that could have been mistaken for the wind in the hall. "It's okay." The words hung in the air, soft, gentle, unthreatening. For most dogs, the sound of a human voice was background noise. For Shadow, it was a shockwave. His muscles coiled, ears flattened, body trembling. Years of fear and pain pressed against him. Every memory of chains, jerks, shouting, hands that hurt, voices that scolded, flashed in an instant. And yet, something in that small, soft voice pierced the fog. Shadow froze, the trembling intensified, his nose twitched. His eyes flickered upward, just a fraction, but enough that Eli's gaze caught the first glimpse of recognition. The volunteers around the kennel were holding their breath. Some had their hands pressed against their mouths. Marlene, the shelter director, felt her pulse hammer in her ears. This was more than patience or hope. This was the miraculous, terrifying brink of transformation. Shadow's head lifted slightly more, nose hovering near the boy's hand, tail flicking in small, unpredictable bursts. His paw lifted again, uncertain, hovering above the floor. He didn't move forward yet. He didn't retreat. He simply existed in the space between hesitation and possibility. Eli whispered again, softer this time, almost a breath. "I'm here." Shadow flinched, trembled, the muscles in his shoulders twitched, but the flinch was different than usual. It wasn't fear. It wasn't panic. It was recognition, something primal buried that remembered what safety could feel like. Then, impossibly, Shadow's eyes met Eli. Not fleeting, not distracted, not fearful, directly, fully, completely. 3 years, 3 long, empty, silent years. And now, just like that, Shadow looked another human in the eye. The volunteers gasped. One stepped backward, tears spilling down her cheeks. Marlene pressed a hand to her chest, barely able to breathe. No one had expected this. No one had dared hope. Shadow's body remained tense, trembling, but there was a spark in his eyes. Curiosity, vulnerability, the faintest glimmer of trust. Eli's hand hovered closer, still not touching, still patient, still letting the dog choose. His soft voice whispered again, "You're safe." Shadow flinched at first, trembling, muscles locked. Every instinct screamed at him to flee, but he didn't. He remained, nose brushing closer, paw hovering, tail twitching. It was as if the word "safe" was a key, turning inside a lock long frozen by fear and pain. Shadow inhaled deeply, cautiously, savoring the scent, the warmth, the stillness of Eli's presence. Another step, paw raised slightly, tail flicked, trembling body inching forward. And then it happened. Shadow pressed his nose against the back of Eli's fingers. Lightly, gently. A touch so small, so delicate that anyone else would have missed it, but for them it was monumental. The connection sparked something deep inside Shadow, something buried beneath 3 years of silence, isolation, fear, and pain. He trembled violently, body quivering, ears flicked, tail twitched in small arcs of uncertainty. And then a sound, soft, almost inaudible, escaped him. A shuddering breath, shaky, trembling. Relief. Recognition. The first sound of communication in years. Eli smiled softly, tears glinting in his eyes. He whispered again, almost reverently, "I know you're scared." Shadow froze for a moment, trembling, shaking, unsure. But then, as if gathering courage from some long-forgotten memory, he lowered his paw to the floor. Not a bold gesture, not confident, but deliberate. He inched forward just a little, letting his body move closer to the boy's hand. Nose brushing fingers again, tail twitching, body trembling, eyes wide but not averted. The volunteers and Marlene were silent. No one dared speak. No one dared move. Every twitch, every breath, every movement of Shadow's trembling body was a miracle unfolding in real time. Another whisper. "You don't have to be afraid anymore." Shadow trembled violently, then pressed his nose harder against the boy's fingers. Paw lifted, hovered, then lowered again. Tail flicked. Trembling body shifted closer. Eyes wide, vulnerable, alive, recognizing finally that someone could be trusted. The world outside the kennel, the laughter, the noise, the chaos, was gone. Only this moment existed. Only Eli. Only Shadow. Only the first fragile bridge between human and dog, built on patience, trust, and one whispered word, "Okay." Minutes passed, hours might have passed. The bubble of stillness stretched. Shadow trembled, paw hovered, nose brushing, tail flicking, eyes wide, body trembling, but he did not retreat. He did not shrink. He did not disappear. He was present. And the moment was profound. Eli whispered one more time, "I'm not going anywhere." And for the first time in 3 years, Shadow believed him. He inhaled deeply, pressed his nose against Eli's hand. Paw lifted again, this time brushing lightly against the floor as if testing the stability of this new reality. Tail twitched, muscles loosened, body shifted slightly closer. The volunteers cried openly. Marlene's hands shook. Cameras were forgotten. Nothing mattered except the miracle unfolding in front of them. A dog who had spent 3 years refusing to look at anyone, refusing to trust anyone, finally acknowledging a human as safe. For Shadow, the moment was more than recognition. It was liberation. 3 years of fear, of silence, of isolation pressed against him, then released in a single, fragile, miraculous instant. And all it had taken was one word. One soft, patient, gentle word. "Okay." Shadow trembled violently, nose pressed against fingers, paw hovered, tail flicked, eyes wide, alive, vulnerable. And then, for the first time in years, he wagged his tail just a little, tentatively, uncertainly, but real. Eli's smile widened, tears streamed down his cheeks. He whispered again softly, "You're safe." Shadow inhaled, shivered, and leaned just slightly forward. A gesture so small, so simple, but monumental. The first real touch. The first acknowledgement of trust. For the volunteers and Marlene, the silence in the corridor became sacred. Witnessing this fragile, trembling, miraculous connection between a boy and a dog was more profound than any story they had ever seen unfold in their shelter. The boy and the dog remained locked in stillness, nose to fingers, paw hovering, tail flicking, eyes wide, trembling body pressed forward. A fragile, tentative bridge between two beings built from patience, trust, and one single word. Shadow's life had changed. And so had Eli. The world outside the kennel could wait. The bridge had been built. The first step had been taken. All it had taken was one word. Shadow's trembling body pressed forward, nose brushing Eli's small hand, paw hovering, tail flicking. The world had contracted to a single point. This boy, this touch, this fragile, trembling connection. For 3 years, Shadow had refused to see the human world. For 3 years, he had avoided eye contact, hiding behind a fortress of fear, pain, and mistrust. And now he was looking. Not just glancing, not timidly, not partially. He was staring directly at Eli. The effect was immediate, almost unbearable. The corridor seemed to shrink. The faint hum of the fluorescent lights faded. Even the distant sounds of other children had vanished. It was just the dog and the boy, two beings suspended in fragile stillness. Shadow's pupils were wide, dark, glimmering with a mixture of fear, uncertainty, and something else, something long buried and almost forgotten: recognition. Eli didn't flinch. He didn't blink rapidly, didn't move away. He simply held the moment, letting Shadow's eyes meet his own. His small hand rested lightly on the bars of the kennel, and for the first time, Shadow seemed to understand that touch could be safe, that human presence didn't have to hurt. Shadow's body trembled violently, muscles quivering, tail flicking erratically. His nose twitched. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to retreat, to hide. But he stayed, immobile in a way that was almost heroic, almost defiant. Every fraction of movement, every subtle shift was an act of courage. The volunteers around the kennel were frozen. Some had tears streaming down their faces. Some had their hands pressed over their mouths to stop from gasping aloud. Marlene, standing at the edge of the corridor, felt her chest tighten. She had witnessed miracles in her years at the shelter, but this was something beyond her understanding. A dog who had refused to look at anyone for 3 years was now holding eye contact. The room seemed to hold its breath. Shadow's eyes flicked briefly to Eli's hand, then back to his face. The connection was electric, raw, and impossibly fragile. It was the first time in 3 years that Shadow had allowed himself to truly see another human, not past them, not through them, not with suspicion or fear, but seeing them, fully, completely. Eli's face softened. He whispered, his voice barely audible, yet carrying the weight of all the patience, love, and empathy he had ever known. "I'm not going anywhere." Shadow's eyes widened, pupils dilating as though trying to absorb the meaning of the words. He trembled again, the motion running through every fiber of his body. And then, slowly, he did something extraordinary. He inched closer. Not dramatically, not suddenly, not recklessly. Just one careful, deliberate movement, nose brushing fingers again, paw shifting slightly, tail flicking in nervous, uncertain arcs. Shadow was taking the risk. The enormous, terrifying risk of trusting a human being. For Eli, it was as if time had stopped. He stayed perfectly still, letting Shadow dictate the pace. Each small movement of the dog was a victory, each breath a triumph. The volunteers had stopped moving entirely. They didn't want to disrupt the fragile miracle occurring in front of them. Some had started recording quietly, but even their hands shook. Marlene could only whisper to herself, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the moment. "After 3 years, he's looking." Shadow's trembling grew more pronounced, body quivering, muscles tense. And then his eyes blinked fully, not the quick, nervous blink of fear, but a slow, deliberate blink as if he were accepting what he saw. Eli's hand lifted slightly, brushing lightly along the bars, careful not to touch directly, careful not to scare. The dog's nose followed the movement. His eyes remained locked on Eli. For the first time, he allowed himself to process the presence of another being without instinctively planning to escape. The corridor's air was heavy, electric, charged with tension and hope. Shadow's trembling slowed, though his body remained alert. Tail flicked, paw hovered, nose pressed closer. His eyes, wide and shining, were absorbing every detail of Eli's face, every nuance of his expression, every subtle cue of calmness, patience, and understanding. It was trust in its most fragile, embryonic form. Eli whispered again, "You can trust me." Shadow flinched at first, but then, almost imperceptibly, he pressed his nose against the boy's fingers, just slightly, hesitantly, A question, a test, a step toward surrendering years of fear. The volunteers exhaled quietly. Some wept openly. Marlene felt her throat tighten, unable to speak. This was beyond training, beyond logic, beyond explanation. Shadow, the dog who had avoided all human contact for 3 years, was making the conscious choice to see, to trust, to connect. Another minute passed. Shadow trembled, paw hovering, tail flicking, nose brushing. Then slowly he lifted his paw and placed it lightly against the bars, aligning it with Eli's small hand. A touch, a connection, a bridge. Eli's eyes glistened with tears. He whispered softly, "I hear you." And Shadow responded in the only way he knew how, by pressing closer, trembling, eyes wide, nose nudging against the hand, paw resting against the bars. The corridor seemed to hold its breath. Time had stretched into eternity. The other dogs in the shelter were forgotten. The distant echoes of footsteps, shouts, and laughter had vanished. It was just the two of them, locked in a delicate dance of trust, patience, and connection. For Shadow, the act of eye contact was more than seeing. It was recognition, validation, acceptance. It was the first step toward healing, toward acknowledging that someone could care without causing pain. Eli remained calm, patient, gentle. His small hand rested lightly on the bars, creating a safe boundary. His voice, soft and unwavering, whispered again, "You are safe, you are seen, you are not alone." Shadow trembled violently at the words, then inhaled deeply. Nose pressed against the hand, paw aligned carefully. Tail flicked, ears tilted forward. His eyes blinked slowly, deliberately, holding Eli's gaze. The moment stretched, seconds became minutes. The connection deepened. Shadow's body remained tense but less rigid. His trembling decreased slightly. His tail flicked in measured, tentative arcs. And then, miraculously, Shadow leaned forward just slightly, as if testing the limits of this new reality. Nose pressed more firmly against Eli's hand. Paw shifted closer. Tail wagged almost imperceptibly. Eyes wide and shining, fully connected to Eli. It was the first time Shadow had fully looked at a human being in 3 years. And it was transformational. For the volunteers, the scene was almost unbearable in its beauty. Tears streamed down faces, voices were caught in throats, hands pressed to mouths in awe. Marlene felt her heart swell beyond comprehension. She had never witnessed anything like this. Shadow, the dog who had been a ghost in the shelter for 3 years, was alive in a new way. He was present. He was choosing trust. Eli whispered one final time, soft and certain, "I'm not going anywhere." Shadow trembled violently, then pressed his nose firmly against the boy's hand. Paw shifted, tail flicked, eyes wide, trembling body leaning forward. The bridge was complete. 3 years of avoidance, fear, and silence had been broken by patience, presence, and one small human who refused to rush, demand, or frighten. Shadow had made eye contact. And everything had changed. The corridor was heavy with silence. Every sound of the shelter, the distant barking, the clatter of dishes, the faint hum of fluorescent lights, had faded into the background. All that existed now was Shadow and Eli. And for the first time in 3 long years, Shadow was fully present, fully aware, and fully engaged with a human being. His trembling had slowed, though his body remained taut with caution. His paw hovered above the floor, then lowered slightly, a tentative, deliberate gesture. Nose pressed against Eli's hand, whiskers brushing the warm skin. Tail flicked softly, uncertain yet alive. Eyes wide, unblinking, full of fear, curiosity, and the faintest glimmer of hope. Eli remained still. His small hand rested lightly against the bars, a physical promise of safety. He whispered again, barely audible, "You're safe, you can trust me." Shadow's muscles twitched. Trembling ran through his entire frame. Every instinct screamed at him to pull away, to retreat into the corner that had been his sanctuary for years. But something deeper, something primal kept him in place. A spark had ignited within him, fragile and flickering. A tiny voice whispered that this human, this boy, could be trusted. Slowly, impossibly, Shadow did something no one had expected. He lifted his paw. Not suddenly, not recklessly, but carefully, deliberately. He placed it against the bars, aligning it with Eli's small hand resting on the other side. The touch was light, almost imperceptible, yet monumental in its significance. It was the first physical contact Shadow had allowed in 3 years. Eli's eyes widened. His breath hitched softly. He didn't move too fast, didn't make a sound that could startle. He simply let the contact exist, letting Shadow dictate the pace. The dog trembled violently, body quivering, muscles taut, tail flicking in uncertain arcs. The paw remained pressed lightly against the bars, nose brushing fingers, eyes wide and unblinking. The sheer fragility of the moment made the air feel almost tangible. Marlene and the volunteers watched in stunned silence. Some held their hands over their mouths. Some pressed them against their hearts. They had witnessed miracles before, but this was unprecedented. A dog who had refused all human interaction, all trust, all connection for 3 years had made a conscious, deliberate choice to reach out. Shadow's paw shifted slightly, testing the limits. Tail flicked. Nose pressed closer. Trembling body leaned forward just a fraction, as if seeking reassurance. Eli whispered again. "I hear you." The words were small, soft, gentle. Shadow's paw pressed a little harder against the bars. Nose brushed the boy's fingers with increasing confidence. Tail flicked again, more rhythmically this time. The volunteers could hardly breathe. Time seemed suspended. Every second stretched into eternity. Every tiny motion, every subtle shift in Shadow's trembling body was a triumph over fear, a testament to the resilience of trust. Eli's hand shifted slightly, hovering near the dog's paw. Shadow responded instinctively, nudging closer. The connection deepened. Nose to hand, paw aligned, tail flicking, body trembling but leaning in rather than away. It was a dialogue without words, a negotiation without speech. Two beings communicating in the purest, most elemental way, presence, touch, and trust. Shadow inhaled deeply, shivering as he pressed closer. Eyes wide, pupils dilated, whiskers brushing warm skin. Paw shifted slightly, pressing more firmly. Trembling body pressed forward. Tail flicked uncertainly but steadily. Eli's voice broke the silence again, soft but unwavering. "You're not alone." The words were like a balm. Shadow's trembling slowed just slightly. Nose pressed harder. Paw aligned more confidently. Tail flicked, then twitched rhythmically. Muscles once rigid with fear began to relax just a fraction. The corridor held its breath. Volunteers were frozen in awe. Marlene's hands shook as she pressed them against her chest. Cameras and phones were forgotten. Nothing mattered except the fragile miracle unfolding before them. A dog who had avoided human contact for 3 years, now reaching out, connecting, trusting, and choosing to be present. Then, almost imperceptibly, Shadow leaned forward, just slightly, nose pressing against fingers, paw pressing lightly against the bars, tail flicking, eyes wide, alive, vulnerable, fully engaged. It was the first intentional gesture of trust, the first physical acknowledgement that he recognized the boy as safe. Eli smiled softly, tears glinting in his eyes. He whispered again, "I see you, I hear you, I won't hurt you." Shadow trembled, inhaled deeply, and pressed even closer. Nose brushing fingers, paw resting lightly, tail flicking, eyes locked on Eli, body leaning forward. The barrier of 3 years of fear, isolation, and mistrust was cracking. Each movement, each touch, each gentle nudge, chipped away at the walls Shadow had built around himself. And then the moment arrived. Shadow lifted his other paw, slowly, tentatively, placing it on the bars beside the first. Nose pressed firmly against the boy's fingers, tail flicked, body trembling, eyes wide, fully connected. It was a declaration, not a word, not a sound, but a declaration nonetheless. I am here, I choose this, I trust you. Eli's small hands hovered near the bars, careful not to startle, careful not to rush. He whispered again, voice steady, soft, unwavering. You're safe, you can stay here as long as you need. Shadow trembled violently, then shifted his weight, pressing slightly closer, nose nudging fingers, paw pressing firmly, tail flicking, eyes wide, body trembling but leaning in rather than retreating. It was the most intimate moment of trust either of them had ever known. The volunteers and Marlene were in awe. Some wept openly. Some whispered to themselves, barely able to comprehend the significance. Cameras and phones had been forgotten. Nothing mattered except this connection, fragile and perfect, between a boy and a dog. Shadow's paw pressed lightly against Eli's hand, nudging ever so slightly, nose brushing, tail flicking, trembling body leaning forward, eyes wide, pupils dilated, whiskers brushing warm skin, every micro-movement a story of courage, resilience, and the miraculous emergence of trust. Eli whispered one final time, "I'm not going anywhere, ever." Shadow trembled violently, then pressed his nose fully against the boy's fingers, paw aligned beside the hand, tail flicking, eyes wide, body leaning in. The bridge was complete. 3 years of silence, fear, and avoidance had been broken. Shadow had made the conscious, deliberate choice to reach out, to connect, to trust, and to be seen. And Eli, small, quiet, patient Eli, had held that bridge. The corridor seemed suspended in time. Shadow's trembling body leaned into the boy's presence, nose pressed against fingers, paw resting lightly, tail flicking, eyes shining, body trembling but fully engaged. It was a moment no one would forget. A dog who had spent 3 years hiding, avoiding, and fearing had finally reached out. The miracle had happened. The corridor was alive with a quiet, almost sacred energy. Shadow's trembling body pressed against the bars, nose nudging Eli's fingers, paws aligned carefully, tail flicking in hesitant arcs. The world outside, the barking, the laughter, the constant hum of life, had vanished. All that existed was this small boy and this dog, locked in a fragile, perfect bubble of trust, presence, and connection. For the first time in 3 years, Shadow had allowed himself to exist fully in the human world, not as a shadow, not as a specter of fear, but as a being who could see, respond, and choose. Eli's small hands rested gently on the bars. He didn't pull, didn't rush, didn't demand. He simply existed, calm and patient, letting the dog dictate every movement, every inch of progress. The bridge between fear and trust had been crossed, but what came next was something entirely new. Shadow trembled, nose brushing fingers, paws pressing lightly. His tail flicked. Muscles, once taut with instinctive terror, began to relax slightly. He blinked slowly, deliberately, holding Eli's gaze. Eyes wide, pupils dilated, ears forward. He was alive in a way he hadn't been for years. The volunteers had stopped breathing. Marlene's hands shook as she pressed them to her chest, unable to believe the transformation occurring before her eyes. Cameras were forgotten. Phones were forgotten. Nothing mattered except this fragile miracle. Then came the moment that would change everything. Eli whispered softly, almost a murmur, but with unwavering certainty. "You can come out." The words were simple, gentle, non-demanding, but they carried a weight that no one in the corridor could have anticipated. Shadow froze, trembling violently. Nose lifted slightly, ears flicking. Tail paused mid-flick. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to hide, to retreat into the corner he had claimed as his sanctuary for 3 long years. But he didn't run. He didn't retreat. Instead, he inhaled deeply, trembling body still, eyes wide, nose nudging fingers, paw pressing lightly, tail flicking, and then miraculously he stepped forward. One careful, tentative step, nose brushing fingers, paw hovering, then lowered, tail flicking, trembling body leaning forward, eyes locked on Eli. Another step. And another. The barrier of the kennel, once a fortress of fear and isolation, became merely a frame for this extraordinary act of courage. Shadow inched forward, nose nudging fingers, paws pressing lightly, tail flicking. His trembling lessened with each step, though it did not disappear entirely. Eli remained perfectly still, allowing the dog to dictate the pace, offering only quiet reassurance with his soft voice. "You're safe, you can come out, I won't hurt you." Shadow paused at the edge of the kennel, nose brushing fingers, paw resting lightly, tail flicking. Eyes wide, pupils dilated, ears forward, trembling body leaning forward, and then slowly he crossed the threshold. He stepped out. The concrete floor beneath him was cold, unfamiliar, intimidating, but he did not retreat. Nose pressed gently against Eli's hand, paws moving cautiously, tail flicking in hesitant arcs. Eyes locked on the boy, trusting, curious, alive. Eli's face broke into a soft smile, tears glinting in his eyes. He whispered again, "You're okay, you're safe, you're not alone." Shadow trembled violently, then pressed closer, nose nudging fingers, paw shifting slightly, pressing lightly against the floor, tail flicking, muscles still tense but body leaning forward rather than away. The corridor had become a sacred space. Every movement, every breath, every subtle shift in Shadow's trembling body was a triumph over 3 years of fear and isolation. The dog who had refused to see anyone, who had avoided all contact, who had hidden from the world, was now choosing connection, choosing trust, choosing life. And the volunteers watched in awe. Some wept openly. Some whispered prayers under their breath. Marlene felt her chest tighten, tears streaming down her face. She had never witnessed a transformation like this. It was beyond training, beyond logic, beyond expectation. It was a miracle of patience, empathy, and love. Shadow moved closer to Eli, nose brushing fingers, paw pressing lightly, tail flicking, body trembling yet leaning in. Eyes wide, pupils dilated, ears forward. He sniffed, inhaled, and for the first time allowed himself to feel something long buried, hope. Eli whispered softly, "I see you, I hear you, I'm not going anywhere." And Shadow responded. He pressed closer, nose nudging fingers, paw pressing lightly, tail flicking, trembling body leaning in, eyes wide, shining alive, muscles beginning to relax. It was the culmination of 3 years of fear, pain, and isolation. The first true connection with a human, the first acknowledgement that he could trust, that he could be seen, that he could be loved. And then came the final, transformative gesture. Shadow leaned fully into Eli's small hand, nose pressing firmly, paw aligned beside the hand, tail wagging for the first time in years. Trembling body pressed forward, but not in fear, forward in trust, forward in recognition, forward in love. The volunteers gasped. Some wept openly. Marlene pressed her hand to her chest, unable to speak. Cameras and phones were forgotten. The moment existed beyond explanation, beyond words, beyond belief. Shadow, the dog who had spent 3 years refusing to see anyone, refusing to trust anyone, had finally made a choice. A choice to connect, a choice to trust, a choice to exist fully in the human world. Eli whispered softly one final time, "You're home." The words reverberated in the corridor, carrying the weight of truth, hope, and love. Shadow trembled violently, then pressed closer, nose nudging fingers, paw aligned, tail wagging, body leaning forward. Eyes wide, shining, alive. It was not just a dog and a boy. It was a transformation, a rebirth, a miracle witnessed in a quiet corridor on a gray, snowy afternoon. Marlene stepped forward cautiously, hand extended. Shadow sniffed, trembled, but did not retreat. He had chosen Eli. He had chosen trust. He had chosen connection. The adoption papers were ready, but no one needed them yet. No one needed to rush. Shadow and Eli existed in that perfect moment of stillness, trust, and love. The shelter staff whispered among themselves, barely audible, After 3 years, he's alive again, truly alive. Shadow wagged his tail fully for the first time, a slow, hesitant motion that grew into a rhythm of joy. Nose pressing, paws moving cautiously, trembling body leaning forward, eyes wide and shining. And Eli laughed softly, a sound so pure, so gentle, so full of love and relief that the corridor seemed to glow. Shadow's trembling lessened, but the connection remained. Nose nudging, paw pressing, tail wagging, body leaning in. Trust fully earned. Everything had changed. The dog who had refused to look at anyone for 3 years had finally found a human he could trust. The boy who had patiently, gently, and persistently offered presence had finally been seen and acknowledged. And in that moment, in that corridor, with the snow lightly falling outside, the world itself seemed to pause. For Shadow, life had begun anew. For Eli, love had found its perfect companion. And for the volunteers and Marlene, a miracle had unfolded, a story that would live forever in their hearts, proof that patience, empathy, and a single, whispered word could change everything. Shadow trembling but alive, nose pressed against fingers, paws aligned, tail wagging, eyes shining, had chosen connection, trust, and love. And everything had changed.